voice control turned off. See how this goes. All right, GoPros, how do you get that silky smooth speed shot, without it looking like it's stuck in time in every frame? So there's a couple of different ways that I use to get these nice speed shots, and I thought I'd explain it. Now, first of all, about the GoPro itself, the exposure triangle that people often refer to in photography and in videos is basically aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And with those three, you can control the amount of light. Aperture is the eye, how open or closed it is. Shutter speed is the amount of time that you're allowing the light in, and then ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor itself. So if, say for example, if we're talking about your eyes, when you go out in the sun, the first thing you do is you go, oh, it's squinting, you close your eyes up, right? So what's that doing is what an aperture does. It closes up the gap so that you can you can let in only a little bit of light. Now the thing about the GoPros is they don't have that. They don't have an aperture. So how do we handle that? Well, what do you do when you go outside? You put sunglasses on. Now these are ND filters. These are Polar Pro ones, and they've got a rating on them. So that one there is a 16, and then I've got an 8 and a 32. So this is a little pack that comes, you can get from Polar Pro. It has the 3 different sizes on it. Basically, you just decide which ones you're going to put over it, and essentially they become sunglasses for your GoPro, right? So it just reduces the amount of light that comes in. That alone, if you want, you can just do that. You can just put those sunglasses on and not adjust anything else, and the GoPro will handle it. The thing about it is that what I found is that GoPro will push the ISO up first before it starts bringing the shutter speed down, which if we're after that movement, is not what we want. We want the shutter speed to come down instead. Alright, so how do we do that? Well, it's really pretty simple. Essentially, we go into our settings here. Now, you'll need to turn on ProTunes. Now, ProTunes allows you to change things manually, which are not normally set. So turn ProTunes on. You'll then get the option of shutter speed. So you can see there, I've locked it in at 48. So I've got, now this is relative to, you can do some more research on, but essentially you just make your shutter speed twice your frame rate. So I've got the frame rate at 24 frames per second, which is kind of a bit of a standard because that's essentially it goes down to the lowest frame rate you can go to while the human eye will interpret it as video. You go lower than that, then it starts to, the human eye will actually start to interpret that as separate images. Anyways, a whole bunch of research on 24 frames per second, why people use it. I won't go into that. But if you want to get slow-mo, you can go up into higher frame rates. But 24 frames per second is a nice, if you're going for that cinematic look. Now, then ideally, you want your shutter speed to be double that, so at 48. Now, I noticed on the motorbike, I run 96 because I found 48 was just a little too slow. It was too blurry. It sort of, I couldn't pick up some detail. So I actually go with 96 just because of the speed of it. Then what I do is I set my ISO to basically use the entire range, because if it gets darker in the evenings, then I still want it to stick to that 48 or 96 shutter speed. But I want the ISO to move instead. So the ISO becomes the variable, the shutter is locked. Now, obviously the aperture is locked because it doesn't exist, but we can adjust with sunglasses. So essentially what I do is in the mornings when it's light, I'll run an ND16 filter on top of that. That's upside down, but it doesn't matter, which reduces the amount of light coming into the camera. But then the ISO will move around in that range to adjust the exposure to make sure it's correct. If I took that off and then ran it like that at that low shutter speed during the day, it would be too bright and it will overexpose. So we then put the sunglasses on and it keeps that exposure in check. Now, then in the evenings, when it's light, I can take the sunglasses off, and that shutter speed of either 48 or 96 is actually a little too dark, so the ISO moves up. and increases the sensitivity of the sensor. That's one way of doing it, which kind of locks in your shutter speed, and then you've got to adjust from there. So if it's too bright, sunglasses. If it's too dim, ISO will adjust. The other way you can do it, which is probably a simpler way, particularly if it's light and particularly if you don't have ND filters, which you should still, if you want this effect, you're going to need ND filters, so you should get them anyway. But if you don't, instead, shutter speed, set it to auto, and then instead set your ISO max down to the lowest number, down to 100. All right, so essentially what we've done there, instead of locking in the shutter speed, is we've locked in the ISO, and so therefore it won't allow it to go any higher than 100 ISO. While the sensitivity is lower, that it also picks up more color and so on, so you actually want lower. In the higher, if you haven't done much photography, you'll notice in the higher ISO it becomes really grainy and horrible. Then with that ISO locked in at 100, we can have our shutter speed set to auto, and it will then, the shutter speed becomes a variable, right? So the shutter speed will adjust up and down to suit the exposure. This is good if you're exposed to a lot of light out in the sun. The downside is that you won't get that speed shot. It'll up the shutter speed, and you'll lose that sort of fluidness. However, obviously to fix that, stick the ND filter on, and that will bring the shutter speed back down again. So the downside is that you can't set specifically how much of that speed that you want. You know, if you're moving slowly, sort of around 20 k's an hour, then you want something down around 48. But if you're moving like on a motorbike or something like that, where you're doing 70, 60 k's an hour, then you probably want to aim for around 96. All right, so basically just remember you want your ND filters. 32 is full bright, like skiing out in the sun. 16 is like day-to-day normal stuff, sort of out in the sun, but it's not quite too sunny. And then 8 is like a cloudy day, or late in the afternoon, or first thing in the morning. But you'll get used to what works. Then you just basically say that you're either locking in your ISO or you're locking in your shutter speed, depending on what you're after. So I hope that helps. Give us a like if it does. And if you've got any other questions, let me know down in the comments and all that sort of stuff. And I'll see you next time. Bye.